Sprows Cummings is an associate professor of American Studies, as well as the director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism at the University of Notre Dame. Professor Cummings earned her BA and MA at the Jesuit University of Scranton, and then earned another MA, as well as her PhD at the University of Notre Dame. In 2009, she published her first monograph with the University of North Carolina Press, entitled New Women of the Old Faith, Gender and American Catholic Identity in the Progressive Era. In 2012, she co-edited a volume published by Cornell University Press entitled Catholicism in the American Century. During the 2010-11 academic year, Professor Cummings received a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship to support research on her forthcoming monograph entitled Citizen Saints, Catholics and Canonization in American Culture. In addition to her wide-ranging scholarly and administrative work, Professor Cummings is also an active public intellectual, offering commentary and analysis to numerous publications and television and radio programs, including CNN, NBC, Commonweal, the New York Daily News, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and the Boston Globe. We're enormously fortunate to have Professor Cummings with us today. Please join me in welcoming her as she presents her paper entitled Nation Saints, U.S. Catholics and the Afterlives of American Women Religious.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to speak here today. Let me add my thanks for this wonderful conference and this wonderful exhibit. Among the many things that have been said about how marvelous and stunning it is, I would just like to add that how meaningful it is to have what Kyle called on Thursday night the double commemoration of not just the Jesuits, but of also women religious, something that makes sense and underscores that when you only talk about the men, you not only leave out half the story, but sometimes you get the story wrong. So seeing them together is really wonderful. And I'd like to just again thank Steve, Kyle, Ellen, and Janet for their wonderful work on that exhibit. And the program here as well, I was thinking as I looked it over, I'm not sure that I've seen a conference in American religious history, with the exception of the Conference on the History of Women Religious, where such a high percentage of the plenaries and the papers are focused on women. So I think it's a real testament, and I'm very grateful. It's time to move on to our final crossing into the next life, the final boundary, if you will. I will be speaking about the afterlives of 4 women, 3 of whom were members of religious communities. And I use the term afterlife both literally and in the sense of American Catholic historical memory. The women I will speak about have all been canonized by the Roman Catholic Church. Catholics believe that any person who dwells in heaven is a saint, but only canonized saints have had that status affirmed by the Church, which means that there are many, many more saints in heaven than those who are officially recognized as such. Why are some people canonized and not others? Reformation scholar Peter Burke has suggested that in order to answer that question, you look in 2 places. On the periphery, where a particular cult develops, and second, at the center, where it is made official. In terms of the Roman center, since the late 19th century, sanctity has been evaluated through what we call the modern process of canonization, overseen by the Sacred Congregation of Rites with the final say of the Pope. I am primarily interested, both in this presentation and in the larger project of which it's a part, in the periphery, in the American periphery. How a cult developed, how it changed over time, and what that reveals about U.S. Catholics, how they understood themselves not simply as members of the Universal Church, but also as citizens of the nation. This is a story that intersects with American Jesuits many, many times along the way, and first of all with the gentleman pictured here, John Wynne, an American Jesuit who's known for, he was so many things, founding editor of America Magazine, the Catholic Encyclopedia. For my purposes, he was the vice postulator of the woman that you see pictured here, who you might recognize as Tekakwitha, the native woman who was canonized in 2012. Wynne served as her vice postulator, which is a term that means he was in charge of the cause of canonization locally in the United States. Before that, Wynne was the vice postulator for the group of men we now know as the North American Martyrs, 8 French Jesuits who perished in New France in the 1640s. Wynne was the director of the shrine to the North American Martyrs, and as such, he was part of the elaborate Jesuit saint-making machine. Something that was alternately envied and resented by many of those outside of the congregation. In 1891, a diocesan priest, American diocesan priest named Father Edward McSweeney, complained that the Jesuits were too assiduous in targeting prospective saints and in anticipating the measures that would facilitate a future cause for canonization. He said the society has a general historian who keeps elaborate records of anyone with just a reputation for sanctity and kind of follows them around, almost stalking them to try to... Steve, I have to ask, I wonder, is it possible, I have no idea whether this is true or was true, but is it possible that this exhibit has increased your own reputation for heroic virtue in your congregation? And at this very moment, are people in your community scheming how to, and someday, hopefully long from now, open your cause for canonization? I wonder. In any case, Father McSweeney complained that these practices resulted in a Jesuit monopoly among canonized saints. And he wondered about what about the many other congregations, and he came short of saying this outright, but he darkly hinted that other congregations might be more deserving of this saintly monopoly. McSweeney's real concern, however, was not a congregational monopoly, but a geographic underrepresentation among canonized saints. By the late 19th century, 17 men and women from Central and South America had been canonized, but not a single person from either the United States or Canada was even being considered for the honor. US Catholics blamed this disparity on a dearth of resources rather than on an absence of holiness. Without monarchs or wealthy communities to undertake the long and expensive investigations at Rome, one of them grumbled, it is no wonder that no servant of God who lived or labored in any part of our continent lying north of the Rio Grande has ever been nominated. Father McSweeney proposed a creative solution suggesting that the Holy See appoint a special commission, a special group of cardinals to glorify the hidden saints of countries from the United States and Canada whose people were too poor to sponsor a cause. The famous church historian John Gilmary Shea, John McGreevy mentioned him last night in his talk, also understood that the problem was one of resources. He noted that while persons of eminent sanctity have flourished in the United States and Canada from the time of the earliest sentiment, the condition of the church in the last century had taxed the resources of Catholics in both countries to the utmost. This had certainly obtained in the case of Shea's own favorite candidates, the North American Martyrs. The cause of these men, the Jesuits who died in New France, had actually been opened in 1652 under the auspices of the Archdiocese of Rouen in France. But once Quebec was created as a diocese, authority for pursuing the cause transferred to the bishop there. Francois Laval was the first bishop, and while he was personally very devoted to the cult of the martyrs, indeed the exigencies of building a mission church left him with little energy or capital to devote to this cause. England's victory over France in 1763, followed by the suppression of the Jesuits, seemed to spell the end of the cause. And indeed, it was the restoration of the Jesuits, as well as a concurrent effort, historical effort to publish the Relations, that prompted the revival of the cause. And John Gilmary Shea, who had been part of the Jesuit community in Montreal, was at the forefront of this effort in the United States. He was the leading advocate for the martyrs. He presented them as the ideal candidates for patrons of both Canadians and Catholics in Canada and in the United States. Unlike existing saints, he argued, who were far removed by ages or oceans, the Jesuits had lived and labored and sanctified themselves in our land among circumstances familiar. One particular South American emerged as a flashpoint as U.S. Catholics searched for a saint of their own, U.S. and Canadian Catholics. Rose of Lima was canonized in 1671 as the first saint from the New World, and as such, she was proclaimed patron of all the Americas, from Cape Horn to Alaska. Compared to their South American counterparts, though, North American paid Rose scant attention. One U.S. priest, convinced that most U.S. Catholics were actually unaware that Rose was their patron, urged church leaders to make a greater effort to generate devotion to her. But in fact, most North American Catholics were less inclined to embrace Rose than they were to replace her, perhaps literally, with a rose of their own. This is Rose Philippine Duchesne, who's featured prominently in this exhibit. The desire for a North American analog to Rose of Lima prompted the rechristening of Philippine Duchesne. As you know from the exhibit, she was a French-born sister of the Religious of the Sacred Heart who worked as a missionary on the Missouri frontier from 1818 until her death in 1852. Duchesne had been baptized Rose Philippine, but as was customary, the French custom, her first name was largely honorary. And indeed, when you meet people who are members of the community or educated by the Sacred Heart, they refer to her as Philippine. But while Duchesne had never actually been called Rose during her life, in her afterlife it became a particularly convenient way to dramatize the need for an American saint. Writing in the Catholic World in 1890, one American saint seeker pleaded with the Holy See to proclaim her a Saint Rose of Missouri for these United States. The tag provides what I see as a classic example of how a canonization process can illuminate the priorities of the saint's supporters, even to the point where it obfuscates details about the saint herself. In making the case that the two roses, the roses of Lima and Missouri, had met the same European standards for sanctity, it became increasingly difficult to justify the fact that the former was languishing as an uncanonized saint. Of course, the leading female candidate in the 19th century for an American patron was not a rose, but a lily. The Lily of the Mohawks was the nickname assigned to Tekakwitha, a native convert to Catholicism, who had been born in the same village in which two of the aforementioned North American martyrs, Isaac Jogues and René Goupil, had been killed. As such, their hagiography had long been intertwined, and she was understood as the first fruit of their blood. She was born 10 years after their murder. René Goupil was killed by a tomahawk to the head, and as such is now the patron saint of anesthesiologists, just in case. They had long been linked informally, but in 1884 they were linked formally for the first time when, meeting at the Third Plenary Council in Baltimore, U.S. bishops drafted a petition shown here, in which they humbly begged Pope Leo XIII to initiate the causes of Tekakwitha, Jogues, and Goupil. The letter celebrated the spiritual benefits that would accrue from the introduction of their cause, emphasizing that having models of holiness drawn from their very midst would inspire the devotion of the faithful in this country and afford it native patrons. Note, as one of the highlighted parts here, an identical petition was sent. Two more were sent from Canada, and this is more evidence that in the late 19th century, US and Canadian Catholics really understood this as a shared quest that pitted a saint-saturated culture to the south against a saint-deprived one to the north, with the Rio Grande as that line of demarcation. US Catholics, many US Catholics, were delighted to hear that this petition had been sent, the first step ever on the part of US bishops to initiate a formal cause. Writing in the Catholic World, R.H. Clark observed that the petition was an important step in developing a national identity for Catholics in the United States and Canada. What is a nation without patrons or shrines, he asked. Clark insisted that the bishop's petition represented a bold answer. Yes, America has her saints, and now we ask that they too receive the homage paid to servants of God. The beatification of these three people, he insisted, would give Catholics in Canada and the United States the Irish equivalent of Patrick or Bridget, or the French analog of Louis or Geneviève. Some non-Catholics were not as happy about this petition. Writing in direct response to it in the Methodist Review, the editors of that publication urged all thoughtful Protestants to beware of what this petition pretended, and to remember that the movement to canonize so-called Americans reached beyond the pale of the Romish Church. The next Americans to be canonized, they predicted, would be more closely allied in race to the present superstitious masses of our country, Catholics of Irish or Italian extraction. This kind of vitriol came as no surprise to John Gilmary Shea and to other Catholics. Shea had long recognized that in seeking to elevate one of their own to the altars of sainthood, Catholics in either Canada or the United States would have to contend with not only with a daunting and costly process, but also with the contempt of a Protestant government in the first instance and a Protestant supremacy in the second. Many outspoken Catholics indeed outspoken anti-Catholics reserved special scorn for sainthood and had long viewed the prospects of an American saint as a travesty, if not an outright contradiction in terms. Aware of the manifest contempt with which many of their fellow citizens viewed saints and saint-making, some US Catholics despaired of ever securing a national patron. The fact that canonization smacks too much of Rome, one woman observed, made it impossible for Catholics even to venerate the old saints properly, let alone launch a new cause. But by the late 19th century, an increasing number of Catholics began to argue precisely the opposite. That in seeking and finding a saint of their own, they could weave their religion more seamlessly into the American fabric. John Gilmary Shea was one of these people. John Ireland, the great Americanizer, also talked about a saint that could command the respect not only of Catholics but of Protestants. An American saint, in other words, could potentially provide a double model, one that might not only, and I should say, when they used American saint, they meant North American, and actually they meant United States or Canada, could potentially provide a double model, one that might not only convince the Holy See and Catholics throughout the world of American holiness, but might also persuade a skeptical Protestant public of Catholics' Americanness. And I rely very heavily here on the work of Alan Greer and his splendid work on Tekakwitha, when he charts what he calls her post-mortem naturalization as a US citizen when her birthplace was discovered in what later became upstate New York. Greer attributes her popularity in the 1880s to her emergence as the perfect antidote to nativist perceptions of the church as foreign, industrial, and urban. And he really beautifully talks about how she was used as a way to root this foreign religion in American soil. The premium placed on suffering and conversion in 19th century Catholic spirituality, combined with this desire to affirm the Americanness of Catholics, ensured that with one exception, all of the early favorite candidates for canonization from the United States were connected to the colonial missionary enterprise. Occasionally, this required some rhetorical finesse on the part of the petitioners. Philippine Duchesne, for example, had only lived among Native people for about one of her 34 years in the United States, and in contrast to many of her 17th century predecessors, her chances of martyrdom had been rather slim. Nevertheless, her supporters insisted that she would have died a martyr, and gladly, if only given the chance. Duchesne may not have died at the hand of hostile heathens, but by living in the midst of privations and sorrows, she nonetheless fell little short of the martyrdom of blood. Her life in North America was characterized as one of great hardship, a pioneer on a cold and desolate frontier. She had lived a life of toil, disappointment, endurance, and self-annihilation. An often quoted line was one from a letter Philippine wrote to her superior explaining why she could not observe cloister. "There is not a wall within 1,000 miles of this place," she wrote. Exaggerating slightly, but. Now, Jim O'Toole in the previous session said that the religious of the Sacred Heart, sometimes called the Madams of the Sacred Heart, were often called the female Jesuits, a term that they didn't dispute. But in one way in which they were nothing like they were nowhere near as good as the Jesuits were in getting their causes for canonization through the process. So Duchenne, in fact, would not beat the Jesuits. Even Tekakwitha, who we know who also was renamed in this era as Kateri Tekakwitha, her cause was eventually separated from Jogues and Goupil, and those two were linked to 6 of their confreres who died on the other side of the Canadian border. Her cause was deferred until after it was completed. Helped by John Wynne and his heroic efforts, the Jesuits were beatified, the step before canonization, in 1925, and the Sacred Congregation issued this decree. Here we go, another Jesuit saintly success story. Or was it? Now, beatification is more than a simple precursor to canonization. Beatification permits limited public veneration, allowing only a designated segment of the church to celebrate feast days or to erect statues or altars in their honor or to publicly invoke their intercession. Exactly who may venerate a blessed, as they're called, is stipulated by the Sacred Congregation of Rites in the decree, and typically it's granted to a particular religious congregation or a diocese. In this case, it was extended to Catholics within all Canadian dioceses and those within the province of New York. In an unusual provision, the congregation added that U.S. Catholics living outside the New York province would also be able to venerate the martyrs publicly if their local bishop simply asked for permission. According to John Wynne, this gesture, unusual gesture, reflected the Vatican's awareness that the canonization of the Jesuit martyrs would have special meaning for all North Americans. Wynne's first indication that this might not be the case came from a frustrating exchange he had with Philadelphia's Dennis Doherty, who's pictured here. He's the rather large man in the middle. I grew up in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia and knew a lot about Doherty, and I have to say, it was only when I started working in his papers and saw the references to spaghetti dinners in Rome and in Philadelphia that I began to understand his size, I must say. But there he is. Doherty was a very powerful U.S. bishop. He had a lot of influence, and Wynne wrote to him repeatedly saying, look, just submit the request, this request for public, to publicly venerate. Doherty ignored Wynne's appeals for a year and a half, and when he finally responded, he referred to them as the Canadian martyrs. And this went back and forth, with Wynne referring to them as North America and Doherty referring to them as Canadian. Doherty's word choice was just one sign that this cooperative spirit, which was so important in the late 19th century, had eroded significantly by the 1920s. And even though the Jesuits went relatively speedy through the process, it was still a long time, and a lot could change. And indeed, after 1925, if you look at the articles published about the martyrs in the United States, they're almost always referred to as the Canadian martyrs. One priest predicted that U.S. Catholics would not be too interested in the martyrs because they had been French people whose exploits did not touch Americans. Others pointed out that the Jesuits had never become naturalized citizens of the United States. Now, anachronism is present in almost any study of canonization, but here it is particularly revealing. Rather than welcome the canonization, the beatification, of Jogues and Goupil, as the fulfillment of their search for a first saint, U.S. Catholics interpret it as reason to approach that quest with renewed vigor, focusing on the saints who labored under the stars and stripes. In 1930, with two authenticated miracles to their credit, the North American Jesuits were canonized. Now, canonization, of course, makes this veneration, it broadens the right of veneration by making it incumbent on the entire church. So U.S. Catholics don't need a special petition to do that. Wynne published a new biography of the martyrs, distributed pamphlets with a special novena in their honor, and urged his fellow citizens to increase their devotion. It was not long before Wynne began to complain that U.S. Catholics were not paying enough attention to the martyrs. "It is a pity the martyrs are not better known," he lamented in a letter to American pastors. "It took time and labor to bring about their canonization. It is well worth the time and labor to have our people know and invoke them." For the time being, Wynne would promote the martyred Jesuits as the only saints of North America. But it soon became clear they would not lay claim to that distinction much longer. Thanks to transformations both in Rome and the United States, American causes for canonization advanced quite rapidly during the 1930s. In an interview published in the Jesuit monthly, The Queen's Work, in 1937, Carlo Miccinelli, a postulator, so John Wynne was a vice postulator, he's in charge at the local level. The postulators are in Rome, working at the Sacred Congregation. He reported that the Holy See was at that moment considering a dozen US causes, more than 3 times the number under review in the early 20th century. Of these, Miccinelli identified the Huron Indian maiden as the most promising. She was the lone American he named. This was music to the ears of John Wynne. Having deferred the pursuit of Tekakwitha's cause until after their confreres, Wynne became her vice postulator and began working on the cause in 1930. Reports from Rome fueled his optimism that she was going to be the next saint. The apostolic delegate, Amleto Cardinal Cicognani, he was the apostolic delegate most invested in an American saint, boasted of how he was trying to get her more known in Rome at the Sacred Congregation. A new biography was published of her in Italian in the 1930s. And all in all, Wynne was very heartened by this. And throughout the 1930s, his confidence that her canonization was imminent really went a long way in tempering his disappointment over the tepid reaction to the North American martyrs. In retrospect, Wynne might have done well to pay less heed to reports coming from Rome and to listen more carefully to what his colleague at Fordham was saying, Father Leonard Feeney, or more precisely to what he wasn't saying. Yes, this is the same Leonard Feeney who would later become infamous for his views on salvation outside the church, but that's long in the future. As a literary editor of America magazine, he was exuberant about the relationship between America and Catholicism. And in 1936, he gave the most rousing call for an American saint. He beseeched the faithful to pray more fervently for the canonization of an American saint taken right out of our midst. Nothing, he insisted, will do more good for the church in this country. Initially, this appears to be a simple reiteration of the plea John Gilmary Shea had made in 1890 for a saint who lived and labored and sanctified themselves in our land among territory familiar. But these similarities mask considerable disagreement over which candidates best represented homegrown holiness. Shea and his contemporaries presented the martyrs and the Jesuit martyrs and the Lily of the Mohawks as the ideal patrons. Now, by the time Feeney is speaking, the Jesuits had been canonized for 6 years, and his colleague at Fordham was boasting that Tekakwitha's canonization was right around the corner, her beatification. And he'd never mentioned any of them in his exhortation. His lament presumed, in other words, what U.S. Catholics' lackluster responses had already made clear. The original favorites no longer sufficed as U.S. rejoinders to Rose of Lima. Feeney outlined other characteristics of an American patron, a saint who is a subject of our nation, familiar with our occupations, whose house we can point out, whose photograph we can show. This homily, which was widely reported it was in the New York Times and Time Magazine. I love it. Time Magazine actually decided to propose its own candidates, including Newt Rockne, the recently deceased Notre Dame football coach. We don't think he would have done very well at the Sacred Congregation. But Feeney's homily highlighted continuity and change. The passage of time had not diminished U.S. Catholics' desire for a familiar saint, but it did transform the familiar itself. Viewed from the perspective of the Roman center, where sanctity is evaluated through the validity of testimony, authenticity of miracles, accuracy of the documentation, the canonization process can appear to be immutable. The pace might ebb and flow and the system can be adjusted, but the criteria for holiness are often presumed to exist apart from time and space. In 1925, one U.S. authority insisted no popular acclaim, no national rivalry can make saints. The process is slow, deliberate, and strictly judicial. Now, a more contemporary example, if you followed the canonization of John Paul II last spring and his beatification 3 years before that, in answer to the questions of had he been fast-tracked and why was it happening so fast, the responses from the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints, now called, were always, the process has been followed. It has been followed meticulously. There is an insistence that there is this process. But refracted through the lens of the periphery, sanctity is much more fluid and historically contingent. The culture in which the faithful live shapes the saints they embrace. And when that culture changes, so too do their favorite saints. Whether or not causes succeed depend not only on how well sanctity passes muster at the center, but also on how easily a saint's story can be molded to support U.S. Catholics' American stories, stories that had changed as they had over the course of half a century. Let's look at the interwar trajectory of the Rose of Missouri, Philippine Duchesne. It shows that holiness had not only narrowed geographically to within national borders, but had also shifted conceptually. By the mid-30s, Duchesne had been declared venerable. Her heroic virtue was affirmed by the Sacred Congregation. And once 2 miracles were authenticated, her beatification was scheduled for 1940. Duchesne's promoters had every reason to expect a lot of enthusiasm from U.S. Catholics. She had spent 34 years in the Mississippi Valley. That's pretty far from Canada. She was not going to be subject to the same criticism. Yet U.S. Catholics responded to her beatification with a detached nonchalance. Public celebrations were largely contained to the Archdiocese of St. Louis or to Sacred Heart institutions. One Jesuit, perhaps still resenting the scant attention paid to his own confreres, chastised U.S. Catholics for their lack of interest in the splendid heroism of Philippine Duchesne. In what was undoubtedly wishful thinking, he urged them to put aside the best-selling Gone with the Wind and pick up a new history of the Society of the Sacred Heart. Duchesne's adventures, he insisted, were comparable to Scarlett O'Hara's in their elements of romance and heroism. Let's make what is perhaps more illuminating comparison between Duchesne and Elizabeth Ann Seton. It was she who had been the lone exception among those early candidates, the only one not connected to the colonial missionary enterprise. The Daughters of Charity had initiated her cause at the behest of Cardinal Gibbons, who visited and talked about, he claimed he was saying Mass at her congregation in 1882 and claimed to have this heavenly vision that inspired him to urge them to start her canonization. Now, in fact, he was already, 2 years later, he would sign that petition that you saw, so he was looking for an American saint. Seton's cause is beset with complications that I confess I have spent the better part of a year trying to figure out. Just suffice it to say that by the time her material was forwarded to Rome, Philippine Duchesne's beatification was already assured. So Seton's not even presented to the Sacred Congregation until after 1940. But while Duchesne had passed Seton at the center, their fortunes on the US periphery were reversed. As the Rose of Missouri faded in the American imagination, the nun from Emmitsburg gained ground. In 1931, the International Federation of Catholic Alumnae, this is the organization of graduates of Catholic women's colleges, and by 1931, as we know, there's a fair amount of them, sponsored a pilgrimage to Rome to carry a petition signed by thousands of US Catholics to initiate the cause for Elizabeth Ann Seton. New biographies are published, including one that presents her as the mother of the parochial school system in the United States, which had actually been founded about 6 decades after Seton died, but she could credibly be connected to that. And Cardinal Doherty, despite his resistance to help out John Wynne, did not hesitate to throw his considerable episcopal weight behind her cause. And one of the reasons, his nickname was God's bricklayer, right? I mean, he was building all these institutions, and Seton helped him tell that story, justify that. Meanwhile, in Emmitsburg, Seton's promoters were trying to get this documentation together. Charles Souvet, who was the superior of the Vincentians and as such oversaw the cause, wrote to John Wynne, and let me tell you, everybody wrote to John Wynne. He was the expert on how to get a cause together, and he always responded generously. I suspect he would have responded less generously to John Wynne had he known what the Vincentian was saying about his own favorite candidate. Reporting on the status of Seton's cause, Sauvé noted, another cause is being pressed forward, that of a young Indian girl, Tekakwitsa. She is not an American. Mother Seton was an American. All our Americans of today are descended from Europeans. Now, Sauvé was hardly the only person to suggest that the woman formerly defined as the quintessential American had somehow become not American enough. Consider the assessment of Joseph Code, a person who produced biographies of many early women's religious leaders. In assessing the American contribution to universal holiness, Code described the U.S. Church as an extension of Old World Catholicism. He distinguished it from counterparts in Africa or Asia. In those sites of missionary activity, he argued, the Church had sprung from the conversion of Native people. In the United States, by contrast, the indigenous population had been almost incidental to the Church's progress. Even if every red man had been converted and remained faithful, he observed, the effect would have been meager in the face of the millions of Catholics who came from Europe. Few statements expressed more clearly the vicissitudes in U.S. Catholic saintly expectations over the course of half of a century. Tekakwitsa and the agents of her conversion had become popular in the 80s because at a time when Catholics were dismissed as recent and unwelcome visitors, they established a Catholic presence in North America from its earliest days. But from the vantage point of the mid-20th century, with members of Euro-Catholic ethnic groups well into their second, third, or even fourth generation, participation in the colonial missionary enterprise carried far less weight. It is no coincidence, look at the date on that, 1935. It's no coincidence that this appears in the United States in the first decade in over a century in which the United States was not absorbing thousands of immigrants a year. U.S. Catholics were revising their American story from a narrative that foregrounded missionaries into one that featured immigrants, and their saintly heroes and heroines were going to shift. Closely intertwined with U.S. Catholics' shifting perspective on immigration was a new angle on anti-Catholicism. Now, as the rhetoric surrounding Al Smith's presidential bid in 1928 made clear, religious prejudice had not disappeared from the landscape. Nevertheless, there was no doubt that these demographic transformations among U.S. Catholics, coupled with the distance from 19th century immigrants, had diffused a great deal of it. Here again, there would be hagiographical consequences. Whereas earlier generations of saint seekers had seen in their quest an opportunity to prove their Americanness, Catholics in the 1930s viewed the canonization of one of their own as a chance to revel in it. Elizabeth Ann Seton helped them do that. Commonweal wrote in 1931 how Seton's private school had been forced to close because of public resentment and opposition. Today, we have traveled far from the atmosphere of such unhappy prejudice. Nobody could today imagine that such ostracism and opposition as Mother Seton encountered would be met by a Catholic educator. Her story and the story of her conversion became a chance to celebrate how far Catholics had come. Now, in the late 19th century, Seton's lack of connection to the missionary enterprise had been a disadvantage. But in the 1930s, when hostile heathens had been replaced by mean Protestants as Catholics' primary oppressors, listen to this language. Seton had lived the life of a martyr from the day she was received into the Catholic Church. On that day, she was disowned by her whole family and that of her husband. Seton's loss of support and income constituted a new martyrdom, a new privation, a new sacrifice, a spiritual martyrdom, no less meritorious than that of blood. So much for getting a tomahawk to the head. That quote is from the biography of Elizabeth Ann Seton, written by Reverend Leonard Feeney, who had beseeched from St. Patrick's Cathedral for a native saint. He published this biography in 1939 and argued fervently for Seton's canonization. Should she be canonized, she would be the first saint in the American manner. And you can see the way he compares her to other women, the other saints he mentions there, this proximity. Those saints are too far away. She would be one of our own. It was Elizabeth Ann Seton who spoke the idiom of the 1930s that Feeney was talking about. Could American Catholics find a saint who spoke their dialect even more fluently? As many of you, I'm sure, know, Seton would be eclipsed as a prospective patron by a contender whose story translated even more easily to the mid-century Catholic vernacular. and who was, moreover, far better aligned with the Roman center. Frances Cabrini was a late entry in the quest for the first American saint. The Italian-born nun hadn't even arrived in the United States until 1889, by which point the causes of Duchenne, Seton, Tekakwitha were well underway. Yet Cabrini's cause would overtake all of theirs, and she was beatified in 1938, a mere 21 years after her death. The short interval required a special papal exemption, and it afforded Cardinal Mundelein a moment in the sun when he was able to boast, and he liked that as much as Cardinal Doherty did. And there was competition between them, by the way, over who was going to, but he boasted that he was the first person ever to celebrate, presided a mass of beatification for a person for whose funeral he had also presided at. Now, I could go into Cabrini's personal friendships. I mean, the woman knew everybody all over the world. And many of the men she had known as a young sister, by this point, had risen to positions of power at the Vatican. But Cabrini's connections, for our purposes, Cabrini's connections, they might explain why her cause moved so swiftly, but they cannot explain the enthusiasm with which U.S. Catholics embraced her as one of their own. Her story fit perfectly to the stories U.S. Catholics were telling about themselves in the 1930s. Now, canonically, Frances Cabrini was a missionary. She founded a congregation called the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And I put this up here because she had fought really hard to get the the feminine form of missionary in her congregation's title, missionariae. Only the second congregations who officially have that in the title, the feminine form. She certainly understood herself as a missionary, but she's routinely characterized as an immigrant. That's how she's spoken of in the United States. Her backstory, moreover, was tailor-made to enhance her attractiveness as a prospective patron. Cabrini, in her childhood, had dreamed of serving as a missionary to Asia. And at the urging of Italy's Bishop Scalabrini, as well as New York's Michael Corrigan, she had begun to consider a different destination, to come to New York, where a rapidly growing Italian population was oppressed, not just by non-Catholics, but by their Irish priests and bishops. Now, as the story is often told, Cabrini went to Pope Leo for help in her discernment. Assuring her that she would find a rich missionary field in New York, he directed her not to the east, but to the west. This vignette would later find its way into almost every biographical sketch published of Cabrini in the United States, but it was in part apocryphal. Cabrini had that visit with Pope Leo, but the evidence shows that she knew exactly what she was going to do before she even went to Rome to visit with him. She had already booked her travel to New York. Her sisters were already learning English. She fully intended to go to New York. But nevertheless, the story, this papally sanctioned transfer from the more romantic fields of China and Asia, as appeared in a Catholic newspaper, to the squalid ethnic enclaves of New York confirmed for U.S. Catholics that she belonged to their national story. The Chicago New World in 1938, it was the Pope, and by implication God, who had ensured that Cabrini work out her destiny not among pagodas, but skyscrapers. Okay, and think of the exhibit. What skyscrapers are being erected in Chicago in this decade? That is how she's understood. Cabrini's appeal as an immigrant saint, and this is key because it extended well beyond her own ethnic group. In Rima's talk this morning, or in the introduction, Josephine Dudzik was mentioned, a Polish-American nun who is a contemporary of Cabrini's, but her cult never leaped beyond Polish Americans, whereas Cabrini was understood as a saint of all the immigrants. Jesuit John Lafarge recalled that she had been as comfortable with Catholic Negro stevedores from Jamaica as she was rescuing bewildered Italians from angry mobs. Lafarge was referencing New Orleans in 1891. Cabrini arrived there just after 11 Italian immigrants had been lynched after being accused of assassinating the city's police chief. Writing about the episode in 1938, a writer with the Louisiana Works Progress Administration described the atmosphere when Cabrini arrived in New Orleans. Every poor Dago was looked upon as a black hand, and the cry of "Who killed the chief?" rang out whenever a son of Italy showed his face. Cabrini's intervention saved the day. The little nun, it went on, set about almost immediately to establish a more peaceful relationship between her people and the citizens of other nations, and soon New Orleans was a better and safer place to live. Father Lafarge echoed this praise, lauding Cabrini's faithfulness and resolve that helped her drag millions into light and health and salvation with one terrific drag of the net. These are just two of the ways in that Cabrini is linked to the second pillar of U.S. Catholics' triumphal mid-century narrative, their defeat of religious and ethnic prejudice. Catholics in New Orleans also claimed a proprietary interest in Philippine Duchesne by virtue of the fact that Duchesne had stayed in New Orleans before making her way up the Mississippi. And this slide is from the Ursuline Convent in New Orleans, the old Ursuline Convent. And you can see there, I put a little extra one of Duchesne in there as well, but there's Duchesne and Cabrini as well. The fact that their causes were evaluated in Rome at roughly the same time invited frequent comparisons between the two. And these juxtapositions typically acknowledged that they had shared holiness and an American connection, but talked about the differences. Foremost among them was the people they served. Duchesne's connection to the colonial missionary enterprise, though tenuous, endured. Devotees continued to venerate the frontierswoman who had willingly gone off to some far-off country to be a light bearer to the savage races who dwelt in darkness. And however much her admirers touted Duchesne's cheerful willingness to die at the hands of hostile heathens, it did not resonate with them in the same way as did Francis Cabrini's fearlessness in the face of anti-Catholic mob violence. Duchesne's habitat on a remote frontier further detached her from the prevailing currents of American Catholic life in the mid-20th century. Her memorable characterization of her new home as a place without a wall had captivated a late 19th century audience, glorifying a pristine frontier. But an increasingly urban-centered population, actively building as many walls as they could, would find her struggle in the crude world of the raw, disciplined, unshapen West far less compelling. And here we find another appeal of Cabrini, the ultimate sister builder, to use words from the wonderful exhibit. This is a mural painted by Robert Smith, and I'm going to tell the story of how I found this mural as a way to encourage, the next time any of you have a really depressing day in an archive, I want you to remember this story. I was at Cabrini College about 4 years ago in a really frustrating conversation with the archivist there, who is also Cabrini's most recent biographer. And she was really trying to be helpful, but we were getting absolutely nowhere. All the sources were in Italian, which I didn't read at the time. Because of that, I have since learned it. But she just was not getting, it was just one of those, nothing was happening. And we finally decide to end the day, and she invites me into her office, and she's sitting at her desk, and I'm sitting across from her desk. And I'm thanking her, blah, 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 about, the disappointment. And I turn to say goodbye. And I open the door, to walk out, and behind the door is this mural. With these words, the mural was painted inspired by the words of Archbishop Samuel Stritch in 1942. We often think of sanctity as being something that you find away off in a distant country, but here in the heart of this great metropolis, in just the same conditions of life in which we live today, nothing far off, a saint here in Chicago, coping with the same conditions and same difficulties which surround us in our own lives. So I see this and that is what I'm talking about. This is what my book is about. And then we just had a great, and it was great. So next time you're having a depressing day. Now, New Yorkers claimed Cabrini as well. One marveled that America's first Beata had lived right in the middle of the 20th century with streetcars and automobiles, slap in the middle of modern progress. She saw these trolley tracks and these buildings, and now she's in heaven. Cabrini may well have logged the 1,800 miles on horseback recorded in her Posizio, but she traveled through American Catholic mid-century memory using decidedly more modern methods of transportation. Cabrini was connected to American modern life in a way that traditional saints were not. As ND professor, Notre Dame professor John Logan put it, she was a saint who overlaps our lives, who helped shape our city and the city in the sky. No American city was more important to Cabrini to Cabrini's afterlife than Seattle, Washington. It was there in 1909 that she became a naturalized citizen of the United States. Cabrini never talked about her motive in seeking citizenship. Her biographer, her most recent biographer, explains that her lawyer had been urging her to do it for many years, saying it would make things a lot easier. She traveled back and forth so many times. She owned property, secure property. But in the minds of US Catholics in the 1930s, they ascribed much more symbolic motives. They insisted Cabrini had sought citizenship to link her institutions more firmly to the country, and to show her countrymen the road of opportunity. Her naturalization signaled her attachment to the United States and her understanding of the American mentality. This is a map of her travels that appears in her Positio, and I actually use it with my students to explain transnationalism. Cabrini traveled back and forth across the Atlantic 16 times, and also many times between North and South America. And I use this to explain to my students that she felt more affinity with members of her congregation in any one of her 67 institutions than she did with her Chicago neighbor, Jane Addams. And I think that was clear from this morning's plenary as well. What matters for our purpose is that in the mental map of her American devotees, Cabrini was firmly oriented to a US center. And if citizenship contributed to Cabrini's appeal, it also helps to explain Duchesne's kind of downward spiral at this time. When the question of citizenship had surfaced with reference to the North American martyrs, it bordered on anachronism. It was a different matter for Duchesne, of course, who had been a resident of Missouri in 1823 when it became a state, and she could have easily applied for citizenship, but never did. Her petitioners were left without much else to suggest that she had ever embraced the nation. One Sacred Heart sister did her best to make the case in a new biography that Philippine Duchesne was more American than French, even before she crossed the Atlantic. But the case did not prove very convincing. Archbishop Glennon of St. Louis, later cardinal, the bishop arguably most invested in Duchesne's cause, wrote the introduction to that book and touted her love of country, France. Not a help. Chronologically, Duchesne may have belonged to the 19th century, but figuratively, she was best understood as a peer of the North American martyrs. And though that link may have enhanced her appeal in the late 19th century, it did very little to endear her to US Catholics in the 1930s. To the Catholics who regarded her as an exiled frontier missionary, Duchesne's Americanness was essentially lost in translation. Instead, it would be Frances Cabrini, the saint of the skyscrapers, patroness of immigrants, and patriotic citizen who would capture their imagination. The exhibit notes that Duchesne never mastered English, and Cabrini actually, she could get by in English, but she never mastered it. But there's no question that from beyond the grave, she acquired fluency in a language that proved more meaningful to her long-term popularity, the American Catholic idiom of the mid-20th century. US Catholics celebrated wildly in November 1938 when she was beatified, and then again in July of 1946 when she was canonized. No ambiguity or detachment here. Without qualification, they accepted Cabrini as a person who, though not American by birth, was American in citizenship, sympathy, and service. In his homily at her canonization mass, Pope Pius XII had reminded the audience that Cabrini's elevation reminded them that sanctity transcended national borders. It's a very poignant homily, made more so by the fact that this was the first canonization to take place after World War II. And he talked about how her canonization could be a healing agent. One priest in Ireland chided US Catholics for attempting to nationalize her. Chicago and New York boast that she was their citizen, he wrote. Americans had forgotten that she sought for a city that is to come. Now, US Catholics did try to remember that Cabrini's newly affirmed heavenly citizenship mattered most. The editors of Commonweal cautioned that dwelling on the luster of Cabrini's canonization had bestowed on the American flag would be wrong. The event honored God, not the United States. But the jubilance could not be contained. The very same author in the next paragraph described Cabrini's canonization as the most honorable event in American history. Other saints and blesseds of what is now the United States may have sanctified our soil, he wrote, but Cabrini was an American citizen, and so an American saint of a new kind. Now, US Catholics had no sooner secured their first saint than they wondered who would be next. And it became a race between Elizabeth Van Seton and John Newman, a Redemptorist, later Bishop of Philadelphia, who, unlike his rough contemporary Philippine Duchesne, was able to transform from a missionary into an immigrant. His story had those threads that he could dovetail with this new narrative. There was quite a competition, and I love reading about this in the Daughters of Charity archives and the Redemptorist archives because they fight over who's going to be first. As the Redemptorist priest Frances Murphy, aka Xavier Wren, put it, the lady won. She was canonized in 1975, and the Redemptorists celebrated 2 years later when John Newman was canonized. Enter John Paul II, 2 years after John Newman's canonization. Now a saint himself, but a fervent saint maker, canonized more people than all of his predecessors combined. He accomplished this, in effect, by implementing a strategy not too different from what Father McSweeney had advocated back in 1891, making it easier for countries and congregations with fewer resources to shepherd their saints through the process by streamlining it in a way that helped make it a bit easier. John Paul II also went out to the periphery to get saints. Where his predecessors waited for the saints to come to them, he went out, and that's consistent with other things we know about him. In fact, this number 482, 2 of them were Americans. The first was Philippine Duchesne. The Sisters of the Religious of the Sacred Heart had actually abandoned her cause in the era of the Second Vatican Council, deciding that canonizing their founder was not consistent with their priorities, and they had given it up. The Congregation for the Causes of the Saints called them and asked that if they would reconsider, and part of the appeal was that South American alumni of Sacred Heart institutions were very supportive, read money, which is so ironic, right? This is the woman who had started out as the answer to Rose of Lima, and in part her canonization was affected by South Americans. In the letter that the Sacred Congregation, now called the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints, wrote, the initial letter to the Religious of the Sacred Heart, they reported that Pope John Paul II wanted to canonize a woman religious, not from Philadelphia. He was referring to the cause of Catherine Drexel, who would be the second American that he would canonize on October 1st, 2000. Here she is, also in that garden in the Ursuline Convent in New Orleans, because she founded institutions there as well. Drexel is celebrated by her congregation, the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, as the first saint from the United States, which I'm embarrassed to say took me a couple days to figure out when I first ran across that. Seton was born in 1774, which means she was born in the British colonies. The first is important. And of course, Tekakwitha was canonized 2 years ago, the first person from within the present boundaries of the United States who was not a member of a religious community, also celebrated as the first indigenous saint from the United States or territory that later became a part of it. She became the patron saint of single women. I tell my single friends that I think the dating life was probably a little different in 1680 than it is in 2014, but nevertheless, this is part of her appeal. I was there on this occasion, way in the back, so you can see all the way over on your left is her official portrait. I was probably the only one in that vast crowd that thought of John Wynne, who had died in 1949, still believing that her cause was right around the corner. Had he been there, I think he would have been surprised to see that she was really not a national symbol at all, but an ethnic one. As a very good historian, he would have been appalled by her official portrait that appears on all of her holy cards and such, which presents her dressed as a Plains Indian, and much more than, she would not have dressed in that way as a Mohawk, a member of the Mohawk community. Her hair also would not have looked that good, I always say too, in 1640. Now, there are many American saints, American first, still left, so don't despair. The first native-born American male saint awaits. John Newman and the martyrs were immigrants or missionaries. Now, until about 6 weeks ago, I would have said for sure it was going to be Fulton Sheen, which is an indication never put money down based on any of my predictions. If you followed the recent controversy between the Archdiocese of New York and the Diocese of Peoria over who gets the body, well, that's another story. Now, Sheen would also, I mean, he still might, but there's also no Irish-American saint. Joseph Code, in that mid-century assessment of American Catholic holiness, actually apologized for the fact that there were no Irish-Americans up for canonization. He said, He was really sorry about that. And I think this is a really interesting point, and it's the one I want to end with. Where else in the annals of Catholic studies do you find an apology for Irish invisibility? And look at the women. Look at the women. And I think that sainthood, looking at who's popular saints, it's a really interesting way to examine a pattern of inversion. There's no Irish Americans. There are a lot of women among American canonized saints. Whoever is the next American saint, and there are many, many in the pipeline. It's a very different story from what it was in 1884. I think it's clear that it's going to tell us as much about the American church today than it is going to tell us about the heroic virtue of the man or woman being honored. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. It's beautiful.
What a wonderful paper. Thanks so much for closing our conference today. I asked Kathy whether she wanted to take questions. She said, well, it does put me in the position of standing between the audience and the wine bar. And I know that's an uncomfortable position. So